If Christ has not been raised, your faith is futile. St. Paul said this, but is it true? Dr. Jordan Peterson is one of the most prominent public intellectuals of our day. He has several best-selling books, and his talks reliably sell out stadiums. And in his newest work, We Who Wrestle With God, he turns his attention to the Bible and makes some pretty bold claims. So today, we will take a look at this book to see what holds water and where I think valid criticisms can be made. Get ready to explore the value in reading ancient texts, why the definition of truth is remarkably complicated, and whether God's bare existence even matters at all. As always, bear in mind that I won't be able to explore every aspect of the book here, and that I will be focusing on its more overtly philosophical parts. Additionally, to lay my own cards on the table, I have been an atheist for many years, so do bear that bias in mind when you're watching the video. My aim with this book, as with everything I examine on the channel, is to give as charitable an interpretation as reasonably possible. So whether you are a big fan of Dr. Peterson or one of his harshest critics, I do hope that you'll be able to get something from this video. So, let's begin by recapping the general argument of this book, as well as its philosophical foundations, just so we all know exactly where we stand going into our analysis. But first, if you don't want the resentful spirit of Cain invading your newsfeed, then you should check out today's very kind sponsor, Ground News. Ground News is a website and app that gathers related articles from thousands of sources around the world in one place so you can compare how different outlets cover the same story. Every story comes with a clear breakdown of the political bias, factuality, ownership, and headlines of the reporting sources, with ratings backed by independent news monitoring organizations. Ground News are very kindly offering anyone who uses my link or scans my QR code 50% off their Vantage plan as a special deal, so I highly encourage you to snap this up. For instance, let's see how the left and right-wing publications differed on Justin Trudeau accusing Jordan Peterson of taking money from the Russian government. While left-wing sources very much focused on the claims made by Trudeau, right-wing news outlets were much more critical of Trudeau's claims and focused instead on Dr. Peterson's reply. I especially like the blind spots feed, which highlights stories that are disproportionately covered by either the left or the right. This feed helps readers step into the other side's news reality and understand the different narratives that can shape their beliefs, such as left-wing sources failing to cover the recent drop in viewership on both MSNBC and CNN, and right-wing sources failing to examine remaining Republican skepticism about the election process even in the wake of Donald Trump's victory. If I'm honest, this channel keeps me very busy, and I don't have a lot of time to keep up with the news, and certainly not to examine every article I read for bias. So Ground News is fantastic for giving me an idea of the differences in reporting on different stories, so that I can get a variety of views rather than remaining stuck in my bubble or echo chamber. Ground News is giving my viewers 50% off of their unlimited access Vantage plan. This is their best deal of the year, and it will only be available for a limited time. So do make sure you use my link. I think Ground News is doing very important work, and I sincerely hope you'll check them out. But anyway, back to the video. 1. We Who Wrestle With God, an incomplete summary. Before we evaluate Peterson's arguments, it is important to have a general idea of the contents of the book. In this section, I will go over his most central arguments, as well as the lessons he thinks the Bible can teach us and how he thinks we should use them. I'll also be leaving some unsubtly foreshadowed bookmarks to the most interesting philosophical parts of his book, so you know roughly what we'll be revisiting later. There's quite a lot to cover, so please do strap in. The foundation of Dr. Peterson's methodology in this book is found in its preface. In classic fashion, he begins with the notion and importance of hierarchy. But here, he's not so much talking about a social hierarchy as a hierarchy of attention and action. He first points out that when we're navigating the world around us, we just can't take in all of the possible information or perform all of the available actions. Thus, we require some idea of value to let us know what to pay attention to and what to ignore, what to enact and what to leave undone. Peterson's ultimate argument is that the Bible will provide the best hierarchy of values to use. As the channel Philosophy Tube has also observed, this point is very similar to the one made by 20th century philosopher Edmund Husserl, who wrote in many of his works that we do not so much passively receive our perceptions, but actively construct them by the conscious and unconscious structure that we place upon our mere sense experience. In its details, this is a pretty fiddly idea, but it's actually very intuitive at its most basic level. To use a pretty standard example, whenever I record these videos, I have on my desk a mug of tea, which I drink a bit of in between takes. If I hold it in front of me now, chances are you will habitually see it as simply a mug. But you can also break that perception apart and instead view it as a cup and a handle. If you wanted, you could observe it as a collection of molecules, or if you're a die-hard topologist, you might see it as simply an object with one hole, and so be totally unable to distinguish it from a donut or a toilet roll. In each case, you are leaving out some information about the mug and keeping in and prioritizing other information. When Peterson says that we are unavoidably taking part in a constant active process of valuing some things and devaluing others, even at the level of perception, this is partly what I take him to mean. To quote directly from the book, "We perceive in accordance with our aim." This value-ladenness of our experience more obviously extends to our actions. Peterson echoes the remarks of Jean-Paul Sartre that when we act, we are, implicitly or explicitly, making value judgments about what we think is better or worse to do. If I decide that I will give some money to a malaria charity over getting a coffee, or vice versa, Peterson and Sartre both think that I'm implicitly saying it is better to have made the choice that I did than the opposite one. Not necessarily in absolute terms, but at the very least that it is better for me to do at that time. After this, Peterson then continues very much in the tradition of Kierkegaard and says that valuing something as good is both an act of faith as well as one of sacrifice. The faith component is because whenever we decide that one thing is better than another thing, we could be wrong. And the sacrifice component comes from the fact that in valuing one thing higher than other things, we are necessarily devaluing those other things. This mirrors Kierkegaard's idea that in order to live a fulfilling life, we need faith. Because we have a finite amount of time and can do a finite number of things, and yet there are an infinite number of things that we could potentially do, which all then have to be given up when we do make decisions about what we will actually do. This would not necessarily be the case if humans were immortal or had infinite cognitive power, but sadly, we do not. Or at least, I don't. If you happen to be an immortal genius, then please do drop me an email. So if we are doomed to make choices about values, a question then naturally presents itself. How should we value things? Or, as Peterson puts it, what is the appropriate hierarchy of value through which the world most productively, generously, and sustainably reveals itself? In some ways, this is a variant on one of the oldest philosophical issues of all, how to live a good life. And Peterson thinks that the best way to answer this question is through a careful interpretation of the Bible. His reasons for specifically choosing the Bible are largely practical. It is one of the most influential texts in history and has arguably underwritten some of the most successful civilizations known to man. He also states that since it has been around for a very long time, it has withstood the test of people refining, correcting, and analyzing it. And, as a historical point, there is probably something in this. As professors Ronald Hertzman and William Cook often point out in their own lectures on medieval literature, for much of European history, the Bible was not just a book, it was the book. It was considered the ultimate spiritual, moral, and practical guide to life, and its historical influence does not really have any apt comparison in literature today. Though it does remain an open question to what extent the credit for the success of European and North American nations is attributable to the Bible. After this, Dr. Peterson analyzes a number of Old Testament stories and explores what he sees as the key lessons behind each one. He says that the book of Genesis reveals something about the nature of consciousness, that it is how we both reflect upon the past and make decisions about how to shape the future. From the tale of Cain and Abel, he draws lessons about how we must sacrifice all of ourselves unreservedly to the correct value system in order to live a fulfilling life, and that substandard sacrifices simply will not be sufficient. He also talks about our capacity to embrace the resentment of Cain and choose to destroy others and ourselves rather than become better and grow as people. From the Tower of Babel, he warns of the danger in supplanting a productive set of values for an unproductive one, as well as the societal damage of a community not unifying around a single set of values but following many at once. From the story of Abraham, he explains the importance of personal adventure, leaving what is comfortable and caring not just for ourselves but for others as well. From Moses, he draws various lessons about leadership and societal organization, including what he takes to be the proper exercise of both authority and freedom. And from the tale of Jonah, he warns of the dangers of running from your conscience and values to pursue your own selfish aims, and how it will eventually destroy you from the inside. We will go into some of these in more detail later, but this is just to give a taste. Peterson ultimately takes these lessons as the key to a fulfilling life, crafting functional societies and giving us our proper value hierarchy that we ought to live by. That is, unless we want to cause immense suffering, both for ourselves and for the people around us. So, that is an overview of the book in incredibly broad strokes, as well as some of the background of the pre-existing philosophies which relate to it. But next, I want to examine some of the more mysterious language Dr. Peterson uses, and, more importantly, how it affects his arguments, especially if you're an atheist. If you want to help me make more videos like this, then please consider supporting me on Patreon to both aid the channel and get access to occasional exclusive content. The link is in the description. 2. Language, Truth, and Pragmatics. In a recent interview on the Catholic podcast Pints for Aquinas, Jordan Peterson said that he didn't think there was a good argument for atheism because he saw it as an illegal chess move, and a fundamentally insensible position. This is something that even the host of the podcast, who is a devout Catholic himself, seemed somewhat taken aback by. And statements like this, that on the face of it seem really quite strange, are a big part of what can make Peterson's religious views very hard to decipher. But in We Who Wrestle With God, we get a bit more insight into what exactly is behind positions like this one. For Peterson, the word God often simply stands in for the top of a value hierarchy. That is, the thing that is valued above all else, or what someone is ultimately working towards. He has always made some statements to this effect, but in his latest book it becomes much more explicit. In some ways, this is well in line with the more metaphorical usages of the word God in everyday speech. If I were to say that someone had made money their God, you would immediately know that they had made it the sole focus of their life. But for Peterson, this way of using God is not just a metaphor, but the literal meaning of the word properly understood. In this book, God is also sometimes used to mean the proper set of values that would lead to the most successful and fulfilling way of engaging with reality. That is, the top of a value hierarchy that is right and proper. And this, again, is a pretty pragmatic and psychological definition. There's almost no metaphysics inherent in it. And as a concept, this doesn't seem that far-fetched. As soon as we start talking about more and less fulfilling ways of approaching life, it seems at least plausible that there will be a way of organizing your life that, for most people, will be the optimal way to do so. With this definition in mind, his idea of atheism as an illegal chess move begins to become a little bit clearer. If by atheism he means the denial that there are more and less psychologically fulfilling ways of engaging with reality, then yeah, that position would seem kind of ridiculous. But I would also point out that this is just not what most people mean when they say atheism. Usually, they mean the rejection of an agential force approximate to a consciousness that intentionally organizes the universe according to something like a will. But these are two very different positions. Indeed, I think most atheists could affirm what Peterson says here and not contradict themselves in the slightest. Likewise, when Peterson says that the value hierarchy in the Bible is not merely relative, he seems to mean something like it will apply in any or almost any situation. It is once he reaches this point that Dr. Peterson makes a rather controversial inference. He states that if there is a hierarchy of values that leads to the most successful way of approaching reality and as a result leads to the most fulfilling sort of life, then that hierarchy is real in a way that is no less significant than the material reality of my desk or my cup of tea. And, in fact, is even more so. To be totally fair, this is by no means without philosophical precedent. For instance, the American pragmatist philosopher C.S. Peirce once defined truth as the opinion which is fated to be ultimately agreed to by all who investigate. His idea was that we needed a definition of truth that both respected the fact that there is an external reality independent from us, but also that we are limited human agents who can never know this ultimate reality except mediated through our senses and our cognitive frameworks. Thus, he thought that when we used our human word true, this cannot be talking about the ultimate reality that we never have direct access to, but rather the idealized endpoint of our honest inquiries, which will no doubt reflect something about the reality behind our perceptions, but it's not the same thing as that reality, since, as we just said, it's mediated through our particular human standpoint. Part of the idea here was to make truth something much more down-to-earth than a mysterious metaphysical relationship between certain statements and the world, and to thus also get rid of any skeptical worries. For instance, under this definition of truth, there is basically no way that all of our beliefs will always be false, because by definition we will get closer to the truth with honest inquiry. And we are forced to make such honest inquiries by practical considerations. If I want to build a house, then I'll need to know the sort of beliefs and actions to build one that will not collapse. Importantly, Peirce's definition also doesn't make truth relative. The idealized endpoint of inquiry to the question, what will make a house stand up, is not just a matter of opinion. Seen through this lens, when Dr. Peterson says God is real in the deepest sense, he seems to mean something like, if we inquire into what values make a successful engagement with reality, then we will converge upon this hierarchy. In theory, I don't think there is anything inherently insensible about this idea, but as will become a theme, I think that the understandable point is obscured by the more metaphysicalizing language. Similarly, when Peterson talks about spirits like the resentful spirit of Cain, he seems to mean something like an idea enacted upon the world. His ideas about deeper and shallower truths also seem like they're primarily about a pragmatic scale. When Dr. Peterson clarifies what he means by deep, he is almost always talking about applicability to a wide range of situations. It's a bit like how we can have 2 sticks, 2 stones, or 2 tissues, but the number 2 is applicable to each of these scenarios. Peterson would say that this makes the number 2 a deeper thing to know about. There are sort of shades of Platonism here, but apart from a few exceptions, Peterson doesn't seem to think that these deeper things dwell in a genuine metaphysical realm, but are rather patterns that we can spot again and again in our experience. For example, he thinks the observation that resentment will make your life a living hell is applicable to a huge range of situations and is thus deeper than something like, I have a picture hanging on my wall. Again, I don't have any objection to this definition in principle. You can just stipulate definitions if you like. But I do wish that this meaning was much more clearly signalled because it is a slightly esoteric way of using the word. This pragmatic through-line is also seen in Peterson's definition of belief, which he says is pointedly not the subscription to a proposition, but rather what we are willing to act in accordance with or sacrifice to. And I have an awful lot of sympathy with this position. It is very similar to C.S. Peirce's definition of belief and the one found in Frank Ramsey's posthumously published notes. For example, we might ask, do murderers genuinely believe in God? Because if they actually believed, would they not refrain from murdering? Is this action not simply incompatible with the idea that there is a supreme moral order with God's commands resting at the top of it? Peterson would be very skeptical of the murderer's professed belief. Personally, I think we can get around this difficulty by postulating a difference between theoretical belief and practical belief. Then we can say the murderer might theoretically believe in God, but they do not practically believe. That is, a belief in God is not a good way of predicting their behaviour. As far as I can tell, Dr. Peterson is largely concerned with practical belief, even to the exclusion of theoretical belief. This may be why he thinks there are not many true atheists, since unless we never act at all, we will be continually making choices and thus enacting a value system upon the world, even if it is a naive and unreflective one. The difficulty for me is that Peterson ends up expressing these philosophically debatable but certainly not insensible points about pragmatic ideas of truth, belief, and God in extremely metaphysical language that makes it sound like he's positing the straightforward existence of God in the manner of, say, Aquinas or Augustine, who both said in no uncertain terms that God was there as a personal being who intervened directly with the world in observable, if mysterious, ways. For example, they are both said to have had explicit, unmistakable encounters with angels. And this seems like a very different idea of God and the supernatural than the one Peterson's talking about. And, as I'll go on to say later in the video, I do think that the metaphysical question of the existence of God does still matter. Take the idea of an afterlife that's found in many theistic traditions. It makes a difference whether there truly is somewhere we will go to when we die, because that has a genuine bearing on our future experience. As proponents of eschatological verification pointed out in the 20th century, whether God exists or not is not a strictly unverifiable question, it's just unverifiable before death. It's because of concerns like this that I think that the straightforward metaphysical question of God's existence is still incredibly valuable, even apart from any analysis about symbolism, which I also do agree can be worth looking at. While I am sure that Dr. Peterson either knows this difference or has a positive argument that the two dimensions are inseparable, by not directly addressing the distinction in detail, it sometimes means the points in the book come across as making leaps in logic that I don't actually think are intended. at least not on a charitable reading. The idea that the Bible potentially contains an extremely successful set of lessons that reflect what he thinks is the optimal way of engaging with reality is not ridiculous, even if I would disagree with aspects of it. But the notion that the lessons of the Bible are incredibly useful, and as a result there truly is a God in the ordinary sense of the word, strikes me as much more tenuous. At the very least, it would require arguing not just that there is a pragmatic idea of truth, belief, and God, but the more metaphysical interpretations of these words are somehow grand mistakes. But with those definitions established, let's now examine some of the lessons themselves, and, more importantly, what the specific role of the Bible does for both their articulation and their ultimate argumentation. 3. Biblical lessons. Why listen? So far, we have largely looked at the foundational philosophy and definitions which underpin Dr. Peterson's book. But now, I want to examine his reasons for choosing the Bible specifically and the contents of just a few of the lessons. We have already looked at some of the initial reasons Peterson chose to look at the Bible, that it is probably the most influential text in European history and has also withstood the test of time and thus the refinement and analysis of many successive generations. However, it is also worth pointing out that just because an idea is old, that doesn't necessarily mean it's good. This is also implicit in Peterson's approach, since he does occasionally praise the Bible relative to other ancient texts and ideas. Ultimately, I think that Peterson is making an empirical claim about the unchanging utility of the lessons that happen to be in the Bible. That is, it is not that they are true because they are in the Bible in the manner of, say, divine revelation. It is rather that he thinks they are true because of their extreme utility, and they are in the Bible because it is a text that has founded civilizations. This is importantly different from someone that thinks that the Bible is authoritative because it is divinely inspired. Given this, there are two obvious potential questions to ask. 1, how much of Dr. Peterson's lessons are purely the result of the text, and how much are the result of him in particular reading the text? And 2, to what extent are the lessons genuinely useful in every circumstance? The first question is pretty vital, because even if we take Peterson at his word that there are potentially values in the Bible that are more useful than any other in history, there is still definitely scope for misinterpretation. To take a very crude one, you might read the massacre of the Canaanites as an endorsement of massacres far broader than this, perhaps even of all non-believers. Or, to take a genuine historical example, you might interpret passages about descendants of Cain and Ham not, as Peterson does, to mean those who work in the same resentful spirit as these characters, but rather as along racial lines, as some 17th and 18th century thinkers did in an attempt to justify the intense racism and slavery of the time. And given both the caution of Nietzsche that when we are writing philosophy, we are often writing what is particularly reflective of our own life experience, and the fact that Dr. Peterson's interpretations cohere with many of his thoughts in both Maps of Meaning and his Rules for Life series, there is the genuine question of what, for him, would make a responsible interpretation of the Bible. I should say, this is hardly a new problem or one that is particular to Peterson. It is why the Catholic Church requires every bishop to have a doctorate in theology and also regularly convenes councils on matters of biblical interpretation. But this does then prompt us to ask, to what extent are these truly lessons from the Bible, and how much of it is Peterson's own philosophy that's been constructed independently? This is important, because even if we do conclude that the lessons in Peterson's book are incredibly helpful, if they come from the Bible, it plausibly tells us that we should consult that particular text more often when making decisions. But if they come much more so from Peterson's own mind, then that suggests something entirely different. Perhaps that clinical psychological training is helpful when giving life advice. And then there are the lessons themselves. There are a few lessons in the book that I think will attract a lot of criticism, mainly ones about gender roles and how to construct society. But I don't know much about either of those topics, so I'm not going to touch them here. But apart from that, I imagine that the primary critique the lessons will face is not so much that they are poor. In fact, I would agree with many of them. The poisonous nature of resentment, the importance of making commitments, and the balance between stability and innovation are all things I've talked about on this channel before. Instead, I think they will largely attract the charge of being truistic or obvious. And to a certain extent, I think that Peterson would agree. In fact, in the preface to the book, he says that since the Bible has been so influential in our cultures, a lot of the lessons will inevitably strike us as very familiar. Take the one about resentment, for instance. The notion that we should avoid being eaten up by unproductive resentment and not turn to self-destructive acts of aggression when we are frustrated is something most of us were taught as children, even if we weren't taught it in those terms. I'm sure many people would say it is quite an obvious lesson. However, I do want to say two things in Peterson's defense here. The first is that just because something is obvious to one person does not mean that it is obvious to everyone. And the second is that we do often forget even very obvious lessons and sometimes need them repeated to us in new and engaging ways. It's also worth noting that Peterson does not claim that any of these lessons are original. This point about the need to reiterate and reflect upon supposed truisms was made very eloquently by the Russian author Leo Tolstoy. He pointed to the biblical lesson of love your neighbor as yourself. This is a line we have all probably heard and likely heard hundreds of times. But Tolstoy also points out that we clearly have not heard it enough or heard it in the right way because most of us are comically far from loving our neighbours as ourselves. I do think there is a valuable art in putting an even obvious truth in a way that makes it stick or is motivational for action. However, I do think one potential critique of Dr. Peterson here is the certainty with which he advances these lessons, even the ones that seem truistic. At multiple points in the book, he describes them as essentially unquestionable. Again, he has pretty practical reasons for thinking this. He is very worried about what would replace these biblical lessons if we began to question them. And he thinks it would be an act of supreme epistemic arrogance on our part. But, personally, I am a little bit nervous about this line of thinking. I do agree that we should probably be more hesitant in questioning some ideas than others due to the evidence in their favour. For instance, I would be very careful about criticising the idea that democratically elected governments are, on balance, the most desirable way of organising political power. However, I do think there can be innovation in even the most central of concepts and ideas. And to a certain extent, Peterson must think this as well, since his definitions of truth and belief go against much of the prevailing philosophical and theological thinking of the past 2,000 years. I can understand the instinct to keep some beliefs as unquestionable if you truly think there are no better alternatives. But, to mirror his own position on the importance of the pursuit of free inquiry, we would hope that if these were truly inviolable lessons, they would withstand questioning. I'm sure that Peterson would think that is naively optimistic of me, but without an epistemically rigorous way of telling which statements should not be questioned and which can, I worry that this sort of idea could end up promoting the very sort of authoritarianism that Dr. Peterson himself seems very worried about. Isn't this just the sort of reasoning that could be seized upon and abused by a bad actor? But lastly, I want to look at one of the most important and fascinating aspects of Peterson's approach in this book. The role of symbols and storytelling. 4. Drunk on symbols? Professor Richard Dawkins recently described Jordan Peterson as drunk on symbols, and I can see how he would get that impression. When he poses questions like, is fire a predator, I can feel my addled analytic philosophy brain groaning a little bit. As I said earlier in the video, I do think that when Dr. Peterson puts his points in very metaphysical language, it can make it seem like he is positing some spiritual realm of symbols that represents ultimate reality. However, I do also think that there are some pragmatic reasons to consider the kind of symbolic analysis that Peterson advocates for, though perhaps not quite in the way that he might intend. The first thing to note about symbols and stories is that they are incredibly easy to remember in comparison to a straightforward lesson. You can find this point in the writings of almost every memory expert or memory athlete. Take Dominic O'Brien, for example. He was an 8-time world memory champion, and many of the techniques in his books revolve around creating vivid images and then embedding them in some kind of narrative format, even if that's as simple as a walk around a location. You may have found this utility for symbols and stories in your own life. If you try to recall the contents of the last non-fiction book you read, that will probably be remarkably difficult. On the other hand, I bet you can trace the narrative of the last decent story you read. I certainly find this. I have to refresh my memory of the philosophers I mention on this channel almost every time I write about them, but I can recall the plot of Crime and Punishment beat for beat ever since I first read it. There is a value in storing our lessons in images and narratives so that they can be more easily remembered and thus potentially more easily enacted. Secondly, symbols are a wonderfully efficient way of encoding information. Perhaps the greatest examples of this are in Aesop's fables. In one story, a fox leaps to try and get some grapes, but repeatedly fails, and then marches off in a huff, declaring that the grapes must be sour. That took all of about 10 seconds to say, but it contains a lot of potentially very helpful information. It tells us about our tendency to resent what we cannot get, and how this can stop us trying to achieve what we genuinely want. It speaks to the unpleasantness of such a mental state, and it also makes us question what alternative paths the fox could have taken. Each of these points can then be reflected upon, developed, and questioned. Not only is this more compelling than simply spelling out the points with no accompanying narrative, it allows us to squeeze more information into less space, allowing us to learn more easily. This is, again, a great practical use for symbols and stories. Thirdly, I do agree with Peterson that cross-cultural analyses of the different stories that different cultures tell can reveal lessons that are pretty widely applicable. And these are often found in their myths and legends and fables and narratives. Additionally, I don't think that Peterson is wrong that the question of what symbolic framework we use to understand the world is pretty significant. There is a whole field of philosophy that aims to investigate this that I've talked on the channel before called conceptual engineering. And the central idea of conceptual engineering is that we should design our concepts and language in order to suit our needs and allow us to most successfully engage with the world. For example, imagine that we had no word for mammal. Well, then we would be much less efficient in how we transmitted information about those animals. When I call something a mammal, then you know that in almost all cases it will give birth to live young, have warm blood, and produce milk. Without this helpful way of organising our concepts, zoology would be hindered in its investigative efforts. Seen through this lens, Peterson's question of is fire a predator can then be viewed as asking, would fire be usefully treated as a predator? Personally, I still think that the answer is gently no, because I think that the designation predator is probably more helpful when kept to biological creatures, but at the very least the question does make sense. As the criminally underrated Polish thinker Alfred Korzybski pointed out, the word is can make things seem much more fixed and object-like than they actually are. A reframing of Peterson's ideas without all of this language of being and existence could potentially make it far more widely understandable, and avoid the offhand dismissals of people like Dawkins. Then, the lessons and organisational principles could be engaged with on their own terms to see what holds up to further scrutiny. Because, ultimately, I do think that the symbolic organisation of our perceptions, values and actions are matters of great philosophical interest. And when it's approached from a more philosophically pragmatist angle, Dr. Peterson's book does provide a lot of food for thought on this very topic. But when his thoughts are expressed as not just that the questions of value and symbolic organisation are unavoidable and we must ask and re-ask them each and every day, but instead as something like God exists and we are all wrestling with him, it makes it seem like the point being made is much more metaphysical and, as a result, also makes it much easier to dismiss out of hand. Likewise, it is one thing to say that the symbolic organisation of our concepts is an important question, because it does arguably have a huge bearing on not just our own lives, but our entire societies, since this is not just the medium through which we think, but also how we communicate with one another. But this seems very different to the claim that they are true in an ultimate reality. The frustrating thing is that when they are given this pragmatic translation and interpretation, the ideas in this book raise very interesting questions about the strengths and weaknesses of different approaches to life, what is questionable and what is not, and the interplay of tradition and development in the progress of a community. It also argues for the value of stories as ways of transferring information and asks what we can learn from ancient texts. And these are two propositions that I think are very much worth engaging with. That being said, I still do have these two main concerns about the book that I've already spoken about. The first is that the lessons from the Bible are often presented as unquestionable, and that attempting to do so is akin to Adam and Eve arrogantly thinking that they can define good and evil. Personally, I think this is a little too extreme for my tastes. I certainly sympathise with the concerns of people like G.K. Chesterton that we should be very careful about upending traditions before we have a clear idea of what they are there for. But I would also echo the worries of Enlightenment philosopher John Stuart Mill that treating anything as unquestionable can lead it to becoming unhelpful dogma. If part of Peterson's argument that we should take the Bible very seriously is that it has gone through the refinement of many generations, then surely we should continue this valuable process. Secondly, I do not think that even if we take almost every proposition in this book as read, that it implies that God exists, or that atheism, as most people define it, is an illegal chess move. Even if it does turn out that there is a system of values that undeniably is the best way to organize our thoughts and actions in every possible scenario, there are a whole host of very significant propositions of traditional forms of theism that just would not follow from this. To take Christianity as an example, there is the idea that we will continue experiencing and perceiving for eternity, that Jesus Christ truly did rise from the dead, and that there is a personal, conscious being with whom I can have a reciprocal relationship. I have a lot of respect for pragmatic definitions of truth and belief like the ones Peterson uses. But I don't think this makes the more straightforward questions of God's metaphysical existence naive, as Peterson sometimes seems to think they are. They strike me as not just worth asking, but immensely practical. So, those are my final thoughts. On the one hand, I would definitely recommend this book to anyone who is interested in combing literature and religious texts for practical ideas on living a fulfilling life, as it is very much in that spirit. However, I would also bear in mind that Dr. Peterson's usage of terms like truth or real or belief or God are not always familiar, and to be aware of how this affects his ultimate line of argument. Privately, and perhaps naively, I am desperately hoping this book might get people talking about philosophical pragmatism, as that is a fascinating topic all of its own. And in that vein, if you want to see my broader analysis of some of Dr. Peterson's other arguments about God, then click here to watch my video on just that. I hope you enjoyed the video, and good luck wrestling with God.